Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Night Shift by Stephen King. Now, Night Shift is a collection of short stories that was published in 1978. However, most of the stories in this collection were actually published years earlier in magazines like Cavalier and Penthouse. In fact, some of the stories in this collection were actually published before Carrie, which was Stephen King's first published novel. Also, several of the stories in this collection actually share links with some of Stephen King's novels. Now, this was written early in Stephen King's career, but as his career went on and his body of work continued to grow, it was revealed that a lot of his books, not all of them, but a lot of them do take place in the same universe, and eventually Stephen King wrote the Dark Tower series. And the Dark Tower series essentially bridged all of Stephen King's books and short stories into the same multiverse. Now, obviously, not all of his books and short stories take place in the same universe, but the Dark Tower series explains that there are multiple universes, so even though not all of Stephen King's books and short stories take place in the same universe, they do take place in the same multiverse. Now, the point I'm trying to make by bringing up the Dark Tower series is this was still early in Stephen King's career. Like, this was before Stephen King started working on the Dark Tower series, which bridges all of his works into the same multiverse. But already in some of the stories in this collection, you start to notice connections with some of his other works. So I thought that was really interesting that you start having these connections even this early in his career, and I'm not even sure if at this point King even knew that he was going to eventually bridge all of his works together into the same multiverse. Now, on its own, I would honestly call this book almost like Stephen King's love letter to the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Richard Matheson, and even to the Tales from the Crypt comic books of the 1950s, because a lot of the stories in this collection have a real EC feel to them, but also a lot of the stories in this collection are very Lovecraftian. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to review each story in this collection individually. So needless to say, this is going to be a pretty long video. Now, the first story in the collection is titled Jerusalem's Lot, and this one is perhaps the most Lovecraftian out of all the stories in this book. In fact, this story was actually inspired by the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Rats in the Walls. Now, on its own, this story actually acts as a prequel to Stephen King's novel Salem's Lot. Now, the novel Salem's Lot was about this small town in Maine called Jerusalem's Lot, and in that book, a vampire named Kurt Barlow comes to the town with the intention of turning all the residents of this town into vampires. Now, in that novel, there was this haunted house called the Marston House that was either haunted or possessed by some kind of an evil force, and you get the idea that this evil force doesn't just possess the Marston House, but it also possesses the entire town of Jerusalem's Lot. And in that novel, you really do get the idea that this vampire, Kurt Barlow, is actually attracted to whatever evil force is already possessing the town. So once again, this story, Jerusalem's Lot, acts as a prequel to the novel Salem's Lot. It's set over 100 years before the events of Salem's Lot. It's actually set primarily in the year 1850, and essentially this story explains what that evil force possessing the town of Salem's Lot actually was. Now, this story is written as a series of letters sent by this man named Charles Boone to a friend of his who he calls Bones. Now, the plot of Jerusalem's Lot is it's about this man named Charles Boone, whose wife previously died before the events of this story, but in the story, him and his servant Calvin move into this old manor that used to belong to a long-dead cousin of his, but as the story goes on, Boone starts to hear a lot of strange rumors and stories about his family, and as the book goes on, or as the story goes on, both Boone and Calvin hear these strange noises inside the walls of the manor, and eventually Calvin finds this map of an old deserted town called Jerusalem's Lot, which is a few miles away from them, and they eventually go to this town and find out that there is something evil living underneath the town of Jerusalem's Lot, and it turns out that his family is connected to this evil, and what this evil is something from beyond our planet and possibly even beyond our known universe. Now, Jerusalem's Lot is an excellent story. I do recommend it if you're a fan of the novel Salem's Lot, because this is a prequel to Salem's Lot, but at the same time though, this can easily be read as a standalone story, but I especially recommend this short story if you're a fan of the works of H.P. Lovecraft, because this story is very, very Lovecraftian. And also, this story is creepy as all fuck. Like, there's a scene in this story where Charles and Calvin go to this old abandoned church in the town of Jerusalem's Lot, and there's a lot of this, like, weird, like, creepy as hell imagery in the church, and like some of the stuff they see in this church is just freaking terrifying. And also in this story there are all the scenes where Calvin and Charles hear these noises inside the walls of their manor, and when they find out what's occupying their walls, it's just terrifying. Like, I would honestly rank this as one of the creepiest short stories that Stephen King has ever written. But yeah, once again, I highly recommend the first story in this collection, Jerusalem's Lot, and without getting too ahead of myself, this is not the only story in this collection that connects to Salem's Lot. The next story in the collection is titled Graveyard Shift, and this one is about these workers at this mill who are cleaning out the basement of the mill, and one of them finds this trap door leading to this sub-basement, and they go to investigate this, and they discover these giant mutated rats living underneath the mill, as well as these giant bats. It's an excellent story, and it's a very creepy story as well. Now, in 1990, this story was made into a movie of the same name. Now, the movie changes a lot from the short story, because the short story is only like 15 pages long, and the movie is a full-length film, so obviously the film expands on a lot more stuff, and the film does change a lot of stuff from the original story, but I love the movie Graveyard Shift. Like, everybody craps on that movie, but I've always enjoyed the film version of Graveyard Shift. The next story in the collection is titled Night Surf, and this is actually a post-apocalyptic story, and this story is arguably set in the same universe as Stephen King's novel The Stand. The story is about this deadly virus which is spreading across the entire planet. Now, in the story, the virus gets the nickname Captain Trips, which was the name of the virus in The Stand. Now, the story follows a group of teenagers who are hanging out at this beach, and they pretty much realize that the world is coming to an end, but they somehow have it in their heads that they're somehow immune to this virus, but that's all I want to say about the story. But Night Surf is an excellent short story, and I highly recommend it if you're a fan of post-apocalyptic stories, and you could almost look at the story as being kind of a social commentary about how teenagers kind of feel like they're invincible when they're really not, and once again, I highly recommend the story, and I especially recommend it if you're a fan of The Stand, because, once again, this story is arguably set in the same universe as The Stand, and Stephen King would revisit this universe again in the fourth Dark Tower novel, Wizard and Glass. The next story in the collection is titled I Am the Doorway, and this one is about this astronaut who a few years before the events of this story was on this mission to Venus, but when he came back, he discovered that his body has essentially been taken over by this strange alien life form, and this alien life form is essentially possessing him and causing him to commit these horrible acts. But I Am the Doorway is a really good science fiction horror story, and you feel so bad for the main character of this story because he didn't ask for this, and you just feel so bad for him when you see that his body is being taken over by these strange alien creatures, and they're causing him to commit these horrible acts. Like, it really is a horrifying story, but it's also a really sad story too if you look at it from the main character's point of view. And this story also has a real Quatermass feel to it. If you've ever seen the old Quatermass movies or the old Quatermass serials from Nigel Neal, like this story has a real kind of Nigel Neal or Quatermass feel to it. The next story in the collection is titled The Mangler, and this one is about this cop who's investigating this series of really horrific accidents, or what appears to be accidents, all involving this machine at this laundromat that, like, steams and presses sheets. Like, it's basically a machine that steams laundry and folds it, and there have been these horrific accidents, including some deaths, all linked to this machine, and eventually this cop discovers that this machine is actually possessed by a demon, possibly even Satan himself. Now, before I read The Mangler, I actually wasn't sure if I was gonna like it or not, because the premise is actually pretty ridiculous. I mean, it's basically a story about a killer laundry machine. Like, it's a laundry machine possessed by the devil. Like, it's a ridiculous premise, yet somehow Stephen King manages to make this story believable, even with a ludicrous premise like that, and I actually really enjoyed this story. I thought it was a genuinely pretty good story. Now, this story was actually made into a movie in 1995. The movie was directed by Tobe Hooper and actually starred Robert Englund. Now, I've never seen the movie that was made based on this story, but I know the movie had 2 sequels made to it. The next story in this collection is titled The Boogeyman, and this one is my absolute favorite story in the entire collection, and also it's one of my favorite Stephen King stories in general. Now, this story is about a man named Lester Billings whose children previously died, and nobody can figure out how these kids died, but he goes to see a psychiatrist, and he tells the psychiatrist that the Boogeyman killed his kids. Now, The Boogeyman is an excellent short story. Like, I absolutely adore this story, and I've read it a couple of times, and I just think it is an amazing short story, and I feel like out of all the stories in this collection, I feel this one has the most subtext in it, or at least I read a lot of subtext in this story. Like, to me, this story is really about fatherhood and what it means to be a man, and essentially in the story you have this character, Lester Billings, who is a failed father. Like, in a lot of ways he failed at being a father, and in a sense failed at being a man, and I feel like a lot of the themes in this story deal with this failed idea of masculinity. But yeah, The Boogeyman is an excellent story, and I highly recommend it. In fact, I recommend reading this before you read any of the other stories in this book. Now, this story was also made into an excellent short film in 1982, and I believe there was another short film adaptation of this story as well that I think was a Russian film, actually. The next story in the collection is titled Gray Matter, and this is also a really good short story. Basically, this is about this kid whose father is a raging alcoholic, and this kid goes out to get his father beer, and basically the people at the convenience store, they know him, so they let the kid buy the beer even though he's underage because they know it's for his father, and basically this kid, he gets his father some beer, but it turns out that one of the beer cans got something in it, and whatever was in this beer can that his father drank is somehow mutating his father into something else, and that's all I want to say about this story, but this is a great story, and it's also a really good body horror story as well. The next story in the collection is titled Battleground, and this one is about this assassin who, after committing this hit on this toy maker, he comes back to his penthouse apartment to find this package delivered to his apartment, and it turns out that this package is filled with these toy soldiers, these live-in toy soldiers, and basically these live-in toy soldiers attack him and are trying to kill him, and basically it's about this assassin trying to survive in his apartment as all these little toy soldiers are trying to kill him, and that's the basic plotline of Battleground, but Battleground is a really good story, and I definitely recommend it. Now, this story was actually made into an episode of the anthology series Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Now, the episode of the TV show Nightmares and Dreamscapes that was based on this story, that episode was actually written by Richard Christian Matheson, who is the son of Richard Matheson, which I find to be kind of funny because this story actually reminded me a lot of the Richard Matheson story Prey. The next story in the collection is titled Trucks, and this one is about this phenomenon that's happening that is actually causing trucks and cars to come to life and take on minds of their own. It's basically like Night of the Living Dead, only instead of dead bodies coming to life, it's about trucks coming to life, and the story follows this group of people who are hiding out at this diner as these living trucks are surrounding the diner. Now, Trucks is a really good story. Now, it is a ridiculous premise, but Stephen King, very much like what he did with The Mangler, he manages to take a ludicrous premise, like this idea of trucks literally coming to life. He manages to take this ludicrous premise and actually make it not only believable, but also kind of horrifying as well. And this story also has a lot of social commentary in it. Really, this story is about our technology literally taking us over, and the whole idea of this story is this idea of our technology, these things that we created, literally enslaving us. So there is a lot of social commentary in this story. And once again, it's actually a pretty scary story. Like, yes, it's a ridiculous premise, yet Stephen King somehow manages to make this ridiculous premise believable, and even though it's not a realistic story, it's as reality-based as a story like this could possibly get, and also it's very nihilistic. Like, the ending of this story is just so brutally nihilistic and brutally apocalyptic. Now, there were 2 movies made based on this story. The first was Maximum Overdrive, which came out in 1986, which Stephen King actually directed. Now, the movie Maximum Overdrive, it's a fun movie, but it's not necessarily a great movie, and even Stephen King admits that. Like, the movie Maximum Overdrive is nothing like the short story. Once again, it's a fun movie, but it's not a particularly great film, and Stephen King is actually kind of embarrassed about the movie Maximum Overdrive. And of course, the movie Maximum Overdrive is very different from the short story, because that's a full-length movie, and this is only a short story. There was also a made-for-TV movie, which came out in the late 90s, which was based on this story. That one I've only seen bits and pieces of. The next story in the collection is titled Sometimes They Come Back, and this one is about a school teacher named Jim Norman who previously had a nervous breakdown, but he manages to get another teaching job. Now, this guy, Jim Norman, has some severe psychological and emotional problems because he witnessed the murder of his brother when he was only a little kid. Now, his brother was murdered by these 3 teenage thugs, and it turns out that these kids who murdered his brother later died, and what happens is he gets these students in his class who look just like the kids who murdered his brother, and it turns out that these are actually the ghost of the kids who murdered his brother, who have now returned from the grave to go after Jim. Now, Sometimes They Come Back is an excellent story, and is definitely one of my favorite stories in this collection. Now, this was actually adapted into a 1991 made-for-TV movie, which does change a lot from the original story, but I love the movie Sometimes They Come Back. It's one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations. And the movie Sometimes They Come Back had 2 sequels made to it. Sometimes They Come Back Again, and Sometimes They Come Back for More. The next story in the collection is titled Strawberry Spring, and this one is about this man who recalls a time when he was in college, when his college campus was being terrorized by a serial killer. And that's all I want to say about this story, but this is an excellent story. The next story in the collection is titled The Ledge, and this one is about this guy who had an affair with the wife of a mobster, and what happens is this mobster plants drugs on him and is threatening to frame him for possession of heroin, and basically the only way he can get out of this is if he walks around the ledge of this mobster's high-rise apartment building. So basically throughout the entire story, he's walking on this ledge and he's trying to keep from falling to his death, and that's all I want to say about this story, but this is an excellent story, and if you're afraid of heights, then this story is definitely going to freak you out. Now, this story was also adapted into one of the segments of the anthology film Cat's Eye. The next story in the collection is titled The Lawnmower Man, and this is perhaps one of the most famous stories from this collection, probably because of the quote-unquote film adaptation of this short story, which I'll get to in a little bit. Now, the plot of The Lawnmower Man is it's about this guy who used to take really good care of his lawn, but due to certain issues, he kind of lets his lawn go to waste, and one day he decides to call a lawn mowing service, and what happens is they send him a lawnmower man who gives him a little bit more than he bargained for, and that includes having a lawnmower that appears to have a mind of its own, and also this lawnmower man literally strips naked and starts eating the grass left behind from the lawnmower. It's a bizarre, bizarre story, and I'll be honest, it's probably my least favorite story in the collection. I mean, it's alright, like, it's a fun read, but it's definitely my least favorite story in the entire collection. And the story, I would say, is kind of a horror comedy story in a way, and I would say that this story probably has the most... I mentioned before how a lot of the stories in this collection are almost like Stephen King's love letters to the EC Tales from the Crypt comic books, and I would say this one has the most EC feel to it. But overall, it's my least favorite story in the collection. Now, this story actually left behind a pretty interesting legacy. Now, there was a short film adaptation of this story in the late 80s that was actually pretty true to the story, but then in 1992, there was a New Line Cinema film titled The Lawnmower Man that had absolutely nothing to do with the original short story. It only took the name The Lawnmower Man, and apparently it originally said, based on the story by Stephen King in the credits for the movie and in the advertising, and Stephen King actually sued New Line Cinema to get his name taken off the movie because, once again, the movie had nothing to do with his short story. And the film The Lawnmower Man also had a sequel made to it, but once again, neither of the two feature-length Lawnmower Man films had anything to do with the Stephen King story. The next story in the collection is titled Quitters Incorporated, and I'm going to admit right off the bat that this is the only story in this collection that I did not reread in preparation for this review. Now, I have read this story, but I haven't read it since middle school, and that was over a decade ago. So this story I haven't read in well over 10 years. But despite the fact that I haven't read this story in over a decade, I actually remember quite a bit of this story, which is just a testament to how good this story actually is, because I still remember most of the story, even though I haven't read it in over 10 years. Now, the plot of this story is it's about this man who is a smoker, and he's trying to quit smoking, and his friend recommends this place called Quitters Incorporated. But let's just say these people give him a lot more than he bargained for, and that includes physically threatening him and threatening his family if he doesn't quit smoking. Now, very much like The Lawnmower Man, this story is sort of a black comedy. However, I do think this story works a lot better than The Lawnmower Man did. Now, I'm saying that, yet I haven't read the story in over 10 years, but from what I remember of the story, I remember really liking it. And very much like The Ledge, this story was adapted into one of the segments of the anthology film Cat's Eye, and James Woods actually played the protagonist of this story in the film Cat's Eye. The next story in the collection is titled I Know What You Need, and this one is about this girl named Elizabeth who meets this guy on her college campus, and at first she thinks this guy is a little weird, but she eventually becomes friends with him, and he seems like a genuinely nice guy, and later on, her boyfriend ends up getting killed in a car accident, and he's there for her, and this guy always seems to know what she wants and what she needs, and he seems like a good person, but as the story goes on, you start to see that really his motives are much more sinister than they appear. Now, I Know What You Need is an excellent short story, and I feel like this story is very much a commentary about how men, especially young men, seem to think that women owe them something, and I feel like this story is especially relevant today, because today you have all those guys who always bitch about, oh, she put me in the friend zone, and it's like, Dude, shut the fuck up. Like, there's a lot of guys, even today, who seem to think that if they're nice to a girl, that girl owes them something, like, owes them a relationship or owes them sex, and it's so freaking ridiculous, and the whole concept of the friend zone I always found to be such a misogynistic concept, and even though this story was written years before I think that term was even coined, still, I feel like this story is so relevant even today. Like, I feel like this story is sort of a commentary about how men, particularly young men, seem to think women owe them something, and it's also sort of a commentary on men trying to control women. The next story in the collection is titled Children of the Corn, and this is perhaps the most famous story in this entire collection. Now, this story is about this married couple driving through the rural areas of Nebraska, and let's just say these two people have a very, very unpleasant marriage, and frankly, they probably both need a freaking divorce, but basically they're driving through the rural areas of Nebraska, and during a fight, the husband who's driving the car accidentally hits this kid, but then they find that the kid already had his throat cut. So they end up driving into this small town called Gatlin to try to report this, but when they get to the town, they see that it appears that the town is almost deserted, and right off the bat, the wife does not like this town at all, and you eventually find out that all the children and teenagers in the town have murdered all the adults, and it turns out that all these children worship this demon that lives in the cornfield that they call He Who Walks Behind the Rows. Now, Children of the Corn is an excellent short story, and one of the things I really liked about this story is, I feel like in the story, like, now, the two main characters of the story, Bert and Vicky, the husband and wife, they're very unpleasant characters, and you could tell that they just hate each other, and I feel like that's kind of the point of the story, because if this husband and wife, like, if this couple would just, like, listen to each other, then a lot of what happens in the story probably wouldn't have happened. So I feel like the story is kind of a commentary on dysfunctional marriages. The story is also very much a commentary on organized religion and people who take religion too far or use religion as an excuse to commit horrible acts, and you realize that all these children, they believe that this demon, He Who Walks Behind the Rows, is actually God. But once again, Children of the Corn is a great short story, and if you wanted to, you could connect this to Stephen King's Dark Tower series, because in the Dark Tower series, now the Dark Tower series deals with the concept of alternate universes, and in that series you find out that there are these spaces between the worlds known as the Ta-Darkness, and in these spaces monsters and evil gods dwell, and if you wanted to, you could assume that He Who Walks Behind the Rose is actually a being from the Ta-Darkness. Some Stephen King fans have even interpreted He Who Walks Behind the Rose as actually being Randall Flagg from The Stand and the Dark Tower books, but I don't personally believe that He Who Walks Behind the Rose was actually Randall Flagg, but that is an interesting fan theory, though. Now, one of the reasons why this is perhaps the most famous story from this collection is because this short story actually inspired an entire film franchise. Now, there was a 1983 short film titled Disciples of the Crow, which was based on this story, but then there was a feature-length film in 1984 of the same name, Children of the Corn, and that film spawned a crapload of sequels and a remake in 2009. The next story in the collection is titled The Last Rung on the Ladder, and this one is perhaps my second favorite story in the collection behind the Boogeyman, and this is an excellent story, and it's not a horror story, and there's nothing supernatural in the story at all. It's just a really, really sad story. Basically, it's about this man who gets a letter from his sister. I won't say what this letter said, or what this letter implies, but this letter causes him to have a memory of him and his sister back when they were children, and this is just such a sad and heartbreaking story, but it's an excellent short story, and if you get this collection, I highly recommend giving this story a read. The next story in the collection is titled The Man Who Loved Flowers, and this one is about this guy who buys these flowers for, he says it's for a girl he really likes, and all these guys are like congratulating him, like all these people are smiling at him, like, oh, go get her, guy, like, you know, it's kind of a sort of a satirical sort of story, kind of like the Lawnmower Man or Quitters Incorporated. Like, it appears to be a story about a guy who's getting ready to go out on a date, but there is a dark twist at the end of the story that I don't want to give away, but this one is pretty good. It's not one of my favorites in the collection, but it is pretty good. The next story in the collection is titled One for the Road, and this one is actually a sequel to Stephen King's novel Salem's Lot, the same way as the story Jerusalem's Lot is a prequel to Salem's Lot. But unlike Jerusalem's Lot, where you can easily read that as a standalone story, I feel like with this story, you kind of have to have read Salem's Lot in order to get what's going on in this short story. Now, the plot of One for the Road is it's set a few years after the events of Salem's Lot. Now, in the novel Salem's Lot, the vampire Kurt Barlow turned most of the residents of Jerusalem's Lot into vampires, and at the end of that book, the town was pretty much abandoned, and to the outside world, it appears that Jerusalem's Lot is just this abandoned town, but it turns out the town is still inhabited by vampires. So, the story is set during a really bad snowstorm, and in the story, this guy walks into this bar in a town not too far from Jerusalem's Lot, and it turns out that this guy and his wife and daughter were driving through the town of Jerusalem's Lot, and of course he has no way of knowing that the town is actually inhabited by vampires, but it turns out that their car broke down in that town, so he went to this bar in the neighboring town to ask for help, and these two old men try to help him, but these two old men realize Jerusalem's Lot's horrible secret, and they're not sure how to tell him this, and they go back to the town to try to find the guy's wife and daughter, who are supposedly in the car waiting for him, but of course the two old men realize that this town is inhabited by these undead creatures. And that's all I really want to say about the story, but One for the Road is a really good story, and there's a really, really creepy scene in this story involving a little girl, and if you've read the story, you know exactly what I'm talking about, but it's an excellent story, but once again, since it's a sequel to Salem's Lot, you do kind of have to read Salem's Lot in order to understand what's going on in this story. And the final story in this collection is titled The Woman in the Room, and this is another excellent story as well. And this one, very much like The Last Rung on the Ladder, is actually not a horror story, and there's nothing supernatural in this story at all. Now, basically the story is about this man whose mother is dying, and she's in a lot of pain, and throughout the story he debates on whether or not he should kill his mother, and of course it's a mercy killing. Like, he's debating, what do I do? Do I sit here and watch my mother die this slow, painful death, or do I put her out of her misery right now and ease her of this pain? but it's an excellent short story and a very heartbreaking story as well. And this story was also adapted into a short film in 1983, and the short film was actually written and directed by Frank Darabont. It was Frank Darabont's first movie. Frank Darabont would go on to write the screenplay for A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, and the '88 remake of The Blob, and he also did other Stephen King adaptations as well, like The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist. But yeah, that was my review on Stephen King's collection Night Shift, and bye.